Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Music of Life podcast. I'm your host, Stanley Jordan, and today we feature a conversation with author, entrepreneur, spiritual counselor, and U.S. presidential candidate, Marianne Williamson. We talked about her new book as well as her presidential campaign, and as usual, I shared my own insights based on a musical understanding of the world. In full disclosure, I've supported Marianne's campaign and I've played music at some of her live events. Now, Marianne is running as a Democrat, but regardless of your political beliefs, I feel there's a lot that you can take from this conversation. The world is way too polarized these days, so the antidote is to hear each other with an open mind and heart. You don't have to agree 100% to get something valuable out of it. The date of this conversation today is May 8th, 2024. Joe Biden has secured the Democratic nomination, but Marianne Williamson continues her campaign because she's bringing up some important issues that neither of the major political parties in the U.S. is discussing, and she believes that a presidential campaign is the perfect platform for keeping those issues alive. And she's taking that very seriously. In fact, if you want to be amazed, go check out her policy platform at marianne2024.com. I think it's more comprehensive and more detailed than any of the other candidates in this presidential election cycle. During this conversation, she got into some of the policies, but the website has way more. We also discussed her new book, The Mystic Jesus, The Mind of Love, which I think is a really important book because it resurrects, no pun intended, this mystical view of Jesus, which I think gives us a deeper understanding because it cuts through these exoteric, external layers of dogma and I think straight up distortions, and it recovers the true teachings and significance of Jesus. We talked about a lot of things, but one central theme emerged, and that is that this modern, soulless world suppresses the mystical, the intuitive, the inspirational ways of understanding and being. And we need to bring that back in order to restore balance for our human species. And that is an area that I believe that music and the arts in general can play a role. But to do that, we need to balance our actions because on one hand, music and spirituality need to hover above the everyday world in order to pull people up. But on the other hand, as citizens, we all have a responsibility to contribute in a positive way. And that means sometimes taking on the real issues of the day. So, how do you balance all that? There's no formula for this. You just have to strive to do your best in every moment. We're all improvising. Life is jazz, and on that note, let's begin the conversation. So, I heard that you actually started out in music as a singer.
Well, I think that's taking a little too far. I sang the way Bill Clinton played the saxophone, you know, and I did this cabaret singing, but I don't have a great voice. I have a great shower voice. You know, if you take a shower with me, I'm great. But it was a very interesting part of my professional as well as personal development. First of all, being on stage, talking to an audience. I had a high school drama teacher named Cecil Pickett, and quite a few people who have done extremely well in Hollywood also were students of Cecil Pickett. It's really interesting. And one of the things he used to say is, even if there's only one person in the audience, play your heart out to that one person. So even though I was the only one in that group, they all became actors and directors and all that kind of stuff. I became something else, but the issues of performance was a kind of training for me. What I learned, because I would sing Cole Porter, George Gershwin, all the old American standards, right? Real cabaret type stuff. And I love history. And so I would love talking about Gershwin and Harold Arlen and Cole Porter in between songs. And I finally came to understand I was better at the talking between songs than I was at the singing. So I got the point. You're meant to be on stage, but talking, not singing. And I'll tell you something else that was interesting. Years later, we used to have, I wish I had known you then, when I used to lecture, people like amazing, Verdine White, Earth, Wind and Fire, Steven Tyler, amazing people used to come onto the stage and they would perform. And there was something going on, and there were these women, I think they were in the chorus, I can't remember which musician, and they kept pushing me to try to get me to sing. And I was really embarrassed because no, I do not want to be singing in front of an audience. I'm not good enough to sing in front of an audience. And I turned to this one woman and I said, you keep trying to, and we're on stage at this time, right? But I say to her, if you keep trying to get me to sing, I'm going to try to get you to talk. And she shut up.
That did it.
So we all learn what our talents are. And,
Uh-huh.
it was not, it was something I did when I was young, but it was nothing good enough to take forward, but an important part of my learning, definitely.
Well, there's one thing that I say to my students because I do a lot of mentoring. I mean, not just teaching music students, but I go into schools, public schools, and so forth when I'm touring. And I talk to the kids about music and how music can help them, whether they become a professional musician or not. Doesn't matter. Music can help them to figure out what they want to do because music activates us like Gene Houston says, cooking on all burners. You know, music gets you cooking on all burners. And also because I've done some studies in music therapy, I started to understand how music connects to every other aspect of our lives and our healing, our identity, just everything really. And so I started to connect the education and the healing stuff. So there was one kid in our town, and the mom came to me and said, I'm worried about my son. He plays guitar, he plays really well, but all he wants to do is play. And he's not doing well in school. He's a smart kid, but I want to get him motivated to do more with his studies. So I sat down and I talked to him, and I said, well, what are you studying in school? And my goal was to take whatever he told me and figure out how to connect it to music. And so he said, well, we're doing social studies. We're doing this unit on the Holocaust. And I said, well, that's interesting that you mentioned that because one thing that I've learned is that music can teach me a lot about history and history can teach me a lot about music. And I gave this example of this song, The Last Time I Saw Paris. And this was a song that, if you're a jazz musician, this is part of the American Songbook. This is one of the songs that you would learn. But I never really understood what the song was about. Then I heard this older guy who was from that era who explained what the song was all about. He said in those days, when you did a pop song, you couldn't do a sad pop song. All the songs had to be happy. And he said what this song was about was Paris after the Nazis took over. And he said, the point of the song is you're looking around and you're saying, this is not the Paris I know. The last time I saw Paris, it was like this and it was like that. And that just, it just almost brings tears to my eyes, just really understanding what that song is about. And so I can relate to what you were saying, and I was able to pass that on to this kid, this idea that music is connected to our history in a way that, because it engages us with all of our senses, it's not just this dry thing, but it really activates us on every level.
There are two things that you brought up just now. The first has to do with how learning music helps you with everything else. The real frontier these days that everybody's talking about is the brain, and they're learning more and more. And we are learning, like, for instance, children who study music in school. It is about the expansion of the capacity of our brain. And that's one of the things that makes it so really not okay that they have taken music and art out of the schools in so many
Right.
situations, because it should be an incredible part of our learning, because it's an incredible part of how we think, how we use the brain. That's number one. Number two, in terms of what you just said, that was a large part of what I was talking about before, talking about the early American pop songs, with the exception of Cole Porter. Most of those guys, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Gershwin, Arlen, et cetera, were the children of Jewish immigrants. So number
Mm.
one, they came here and they were a little bit embarrassed by their parents because their parents didn't speak good English, which made
Hmm.
them even more concerned with the language.
Oh,
And
I
so
see.
many of the terms like they can't take that away from me. That's a
Hmm.
famous Gershwin song. They can't take
Hmm.
that away from me. That it stems from, much like you were just saying, the reason Jews get an education, the reason there's a higher level of achievement among Jews, why is that? Because of the concentration on Jewish children, you've got to get an education. Where did that come from? That came from times when that was the one thing they couldn't take away from us.
Oh, okay.
If you get it, it's
Got
a
it.
one day. Okay. Now, in both Black music as well as Jewish music, that this is where
Hmm.
the torch song came from. So when you were talking before about it had to be a happy song, in both gospel music as well as the early torch songs, for the first time you have, oh baby, I'm suffering, which came from, oh God, I'm suffering, right? Like I
Mm.
once went to see a gospel concert in Paris.
Hmm.
I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. And
Hmm.
I went to see this gospel concert in Paris, and it was totally boring. And I thought to
Hmm.
myself, what's happening? And what was
Hmm.
happening was that the people singing gospel in France did not have a cellular memory of slavery. They did not
Mm.
have a cellular memory of the suffering which gave birth to that music.
Okay.
And I realized it came from the American, it's a specific American experience of the institution of slavery and enslaved people. And
Hmm.
same with Harold Arlen, for instance, in singing songs like The Man That Got Away. Oh, yeah, yeah, if
Hmm.
you listen to the old cantorial music.
Hmm.
So all drama and music originally came from sacred spaces.
Hmm.
That wasn't
Hmm.
entertainment. It's like when you go to a museum and you look at the old religious art, it was not. In those people, we look at it as a museum,
Hmm.
as a category of art. They looked at it as a category of religious worship. So it
Hmm.
is so fascinating, uh, everything that you're saying, and I'm with you. And now when we get off, I'm definitely gonna go look at the lyrics of the last time I saw Paris because that absolutely makes sense.
Well, also with the blues, even though the blues confronts the pain, it always rises above it. You know, like a blues song is like, my woman done left me. I got fired off of my job. Sheriff's after me, wants to put me in jail. I'm gonna leave this town. Or,
Exactly.
or there's always a transcendence or a
Because
victory. Or,
it came from the religious music, which was a way that people survived and transcended. It came from their
hmm.
religiosity.
Hmm. And when you think about like healing on an individual level, okay, so we know, and relating to what you were saying, how music helps the brain and all of that. So on an individual level, music can be therapeutic, but it can also happen on a collective level. So when people get together, they play music together, teens who are going through a lot of emotional turmoil, they get together, they learn social cohesiveness and cooperation through drumming together. You can expand this on bigger and bigger levels. There seems to be no limit to that. It seems that world music, I mean the concept of music connecting the world, it's always been right there, ready to be tapped into. You could probably go into just about any genre of music and find people willing to collaborate. I don't know if you saw the recent Grammys, and one of my favorite things on the Grammys is where they had a string quartet with Jewish Israeli musicians and Palestinian musicians
That's
playing
fantastic.
together. And it was
Oh,
just
wow.
so, and what they were playing was so beautiful, and it really got the point across better than
I didn't know that, but
anything
it
else.
sounds divine. And remember how the choir, as the Titanic was going down,
Oh,
the
right,
orchestra played.
right.
There are so many instances, and I keep going back to the fact that they've taken music and art out of the schools and public schools
Mm-hmm,
in so many cases,
mm-hmm,
and how awful that is because of the difference it makes in the development, even of a
mm-hmm,
child's brain and the soul and
mm-hmm.
the soothing comfort. Um, Also, if you go back further than music, just to the power of sound, there are all kinds of theories about um, the power of sound used. If you look at something like Stonehenge, if you look at things like the building of the pyramids, if you look at all these situations where scientists can't figure out how, given the technology of the time, certain movement was achieved, one of the theories has to do with sound vibration and chanting and a sound vibration, which would create an anti-gravitational force. I mean, there's so much. We think we're so smart, but we really are just beginning to understand certain things, many of which were known at one time, I think, and forgotten.
Well, I think part of what happened is all the developments that happened in Europe in the technology and the philosophy and the culture and all that was fueled in large part by the Gutenberg Revolution, because once the printing press allowed all that information to be disseminated and duplicated and all that, it created a rapid advancement in civilization, right? But here's my point, that the Gutenberg Revolution was only good for visual information. And I don't think people really thought about the implications of that at the time. But what I think it did is it unfairly privileged that that the visual. And so see what I mean? So today we've got the visual having a higher status, and that's why I sort of put air quotes, and people started getting smart again. They certainly did tap into something really powerful intellectually, but it had that limitation of being only visual.
So interesting.
And now we have all the equivalent technologies for auditory. So now we can recover that lost potential. I mean, I think that all kinds of things, including gender conflicts, social problems, I think a lot of issues were possibly fueled by this focus on visualization. And if we can bring the auditory back in, I think it could really help us to kind of come more into balance as a species. As I'm sure you know, the way that the ear works is plugged into our brain in a more comprehensive way than the eye is. The ear's plugged into our whole brain. And so through our ears, we have this whole brain experience. So when you take the visual, you don't have to get rid of it, but then you incorporate the auditory, then I think we are literally smarter. And that's one of the things that I've been trying to do, is use sonification, which is the representation of data in a sound form, to help to bring that about. You and I have talked about this a little bit, but I didn't have a chance to really show you what I was working on. But I was talking about depicting the motion of the celestial bodies and things like that. There's another piece that I didn't mention, that there's sound that goes along with that. So as you're seeing it, you're also hearing it, and you're able to perceive with your whole brain the sort of the dance of the celestial bodies.
Two things that I saw on the internet. One had to do with a breakdown of the first few chords in Beethoven's Seventh, and about how they perfectly match the salve to grief. It was really interesting. The other one I saw was about a crying baby, and they would take babies that were crying and go, oh, and they would do ohms, and the babies would stop crying.
Wow. So I do think that we are poised. I know this is something that you talk about a lot, that one thing is dying and falling away, and something new is struggling to be born. And I don't know what to do about the stuff that's dying. I mean, I think that with your campaign and everything, and the courage that you have to confront all those issues and all the powers that be and all that, it amazes me, and I thank you for that. But at the same time, we have to just focus on the future that we want. Like, you're taking on the old energy even as you're trying to usher in the new. And I do think that the arts, part of the reason why we need to re-elevate the arts, is because there's a wisdom that artists have that everybody needs to understand. Like all the great works of art came from somebody's imagination. One of the things that we artists know is to trust our inner world, to trust our imagination, and to dream big, to think big. And nothing short of that is going to get us out of this conundrum right now as a species.
I think that art and religion hover above and need to hover above. I remember towards the end of Clinton's tenure at the White House, Bruce Springsteen came to Washington, D.C. And the White House called Bruce Springsteen and said that Clinton and Gore would love to meet with him. And he said that he couldn't do it because as an artist, he felt that he needed to keep himself just separate enough. Now, obviously, he's changed because now he's out there doing podcasts with Barack Obama. But in those days, he really got that. And I thought it was so cool that he said that. I think religion is that as well. It needs to keep it hovers just above the worldly morass. And because it hovers just above, it calls people to transcendence. But that doesn't, to me, mean that there's no need in another sector to get into the weeds and get our fingers dirty. It's like if you go to the hospital and you have a terrible gash, the doctor's going to have to address the wound, clean it out, heal it, and bandage it. So I think that's a different task than those who are just teaching you how to learn nutrition and cultivate health. And that's really, to me, what it means to say we have two roles. We have to be birth doulas to what's trying to come forward and death doulas to what's falling apart. I think that if we look at it closely, it's easy for privileged people to say, oh, we just have to let die what needs to die. Well, once again, if you're privileged enough, that's one thing. But if it dies without responsibility and wisdom and compassion, that can be a lot of people who suffer during that death process. Violence can emerge, all kinds of dysfunction and malfunction. So I think that all of the above, listen, being a human being is a multidimensional experience. And we're living in an all systems breakdown. We have to have an all systems response. We have to look at all of those things because they're all meaningful. And they all have a role to play. The people that I've really admired the most are people who, look at someone like Steven Spielberg. He addresses both, but he doesn't let either one poison the other. He's obviously got a lot of political, I think what he did, for instance, look at what he did with he put together that whole thing with the Shoah Foundation, where he has all those. We're living at a time now, the vast, vast, vast majority of survivors of the Holocaust have died. But most of them that did survive, or at least a large number of them, are now on tape because of Steven Spielberg. Can you imagine if we had had that ability and the consciousness of someone to want to do it at the end of slavery?
Wow.
Can you imagine if we have some interviews with formerly enslaved people, but we don't have the kind of, so I've always admired the way he makes movies over here. And obviously his art is not unduly impacted in a way that makes it an ideological compromise. And then on the other hand, I think, we're called on to do both.
Well, also, I like how in your campaign platform, you talk about a just transition. So whether that's to clean energy or, all the big things that you recognize that we need to change, we have to do it in a way that takes care of the people who have jobs in the old industries and that sort of thing.
Well, think about it. We have thousands of people who pay their rent and put food on the table for their children in jobs, at least indirectly associated with fossil fuel extraction. I had one man on the campaign trail say, Ms. Williamson, I make over $100,000 a year working for a company that's connected to fossil fuel extraction. But do you want me to go work for $15 an hour installing solar panels? That man has a right to ask that question, because people could just fall through the cracks. If you just say, okay, we're going from a war economy to a peace economy, we're going from a dirty economy to a clean economy. But what I know, I'll give you two examples. I lived in Metro Detroit for 8 years. I raised my daughter there. And I remember guys that I knew who worked at Ford. And I learned from them that they would love nothing more than to have one of the big three come in and say, from this point forward, Detroit is going to be the world capital for the development of clean energy transportation.
Wow.
They would love nothing more than that, but these were their jobs. They weren't the ones calling those shots. I also remember up at Livermore Lab, somebody saying, do you think we want to be doing all these projects related to nuclear energy and nuclear bombs? No, we wish somebody was coming in here and having us put this energy, the energy of our own talent and resources and development and technology and manufacturing, in the direction of life producing. But this is where the grants are coming from. So, and also when you talk about a shift from a dirty economy to a clean economy, and when you talk about a shift from a war economy to a peace economy, of course, energy from war to peace has to do with going from so much focus on the defense industry to education and to health, which actually gives you a greater return on investment. But I think what's important is so many of these shifts can be made laterally. It's the same technology, it's the same expertise and skill at development, technology, manufacturing, delivery. It all has to do with purpose. Is your purpose to heal the world or to make money off harming the world? That's really where humanity stands right now. What do you see as the purpose of your life, the purpose of society, and how you're going to stand on that?
One thing that I've heard you say, the purpose that you put into something is imbued in the result, something like that.
Yeah, two things. Well, first of all, Gandhi said the end is inherent in the means. So everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. So our intention in doing something goes far towards determining what an ultimate outcome of a situation is. The other aspect of that is a line from the Course in Miracles where it says, nothing in the world is holy or unholy, except as that which is determined by the mind to be its purpose. Look at the internet. That's a perfect example. The internet, on one hand, such an amazing opportunity for good. The fact that you and I are doing what we're doing today, right? I mean, there's so much good, but it's also used by some people for ways to kill, build bombs, perpetrate real evil. The answer to all of that is not in the technology, it's in the human mind. And that's why the change has to ultimately come in us. AI is a perfect example. On one hand, it's amazing. On the other hand, my God, it could control us. It could turn this planet into a dystopia unlike anything we've ever seen. Well, there need to be, obviously guardrails and regulations, but ultimately, the only thing that can save this species is such a revolution in consciousness and ethics that no one would even consider the possibility of using technology to harm people. The evolution, the spiritual evolution of the human race is ultimately the answer, because what's happened now is we have technologically developed into a more advanced species than we are morally and spiritually. And we're in such a risk of destroying ourselves if we don't catch up on a moral and spiritual level.
This is one example of how I believe that the overemphasis on the visual has been destructive, because the visual creates more of a sense of distance. Whereas when we bring in the auditory and then, of course, the kinesthetic, there's more of a sense of connection, not only within our own brain, but also with other people. I think that could be a part of this healing that we need to do. But also, I think just hearing you talk about the intention and the importance of intention, I think that this is part of the conversation on the political level that's been lost in the sort of smug, modern meritocracy that's basically counting beans and saying, okay, my score is here, your score is there, I'm doing better than you, all is well in the world, and really missing this fundamental spiritual element of things. If we look at it from the point of view of integral theory, and this is why I see you as one of our leading integral politicians, because what you're doing is you're bridging the internal and the external. And not that you're the first person to do this, but my gosh, somebody needs to bring this back. I don't know how it went away. I mean, you're quoting Martin Luther King, you're quoting Gandhi. It's nothing new, but we're at this point where everything is supposed to be so external now, and the intention isn't really supposed to matter so much, when really the intention is the key to everything. There's no algorithm, there's no tweak to the algorithm that's gonna solve what we're doing. Are you talking about AI? There's no, Chat GPT 6.0 or something that's gonna solve the world's problems. A couple of years ago when Elon Musk bought Twitter, and the stock crashed and the value went way down, and all these people were going, wow, that was a horrible move. And he didn't seem at all fazed. It's like, no problem. It's like, why doesn't he look worried about all the money that just got lost there? And then later I heard someone say, well, one of his goals with buying Twitter is that he wanted to use that for training AI, use all that data for training AI. And I thought, oh, no wonder he's not worried about the money, because he's thinking that he's going to make so much more money down the road by having this training of AI. And I think that it was good what he said when he said that he wanted to make it more humane and all that. But in fact, it's become less humane. And so why would you want to train AI on that? It's like that's sort of the worst.
People, I would agree with you on that. That's also the danger of having individuals that have that kind of wealth. It's giantism. There was a book called Inside the Third Reich by Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect. And he was the only one of the Third Reich that really expressed remorse and that he got what he done. He went to prison, but I think he got out before he died. But he wrote this really phenomenal book. And one of the things that he said in that book that I never forgot was that Hitler said to him that at the end of the war, he wanted to redesign Berlin. But he wanted to redesign Berlin to mimic Paris, except everything twice as big or 3 times as big or 5 times as big. I don't remember what. So where you have the distance of the Champs-Élysées with the Arc de Triomphe on one side and the Tuileries on the other, he wanted it like that, but bigger. He wanted the Arc de Triomphe in Berlin bigger. He wanted the Louvre bigger. And so Speer talked about that. And he talked about when you look at Roman architecture and then you look at Greek architecture, he said, anytime a society is in decline, things are too big. That's another thing about music. Music is itself a tuning fork. Nature equalizes us. So the idea of giantism is a disease. It's in the body. It's a disease. And the fact that we are now an economic system that provides for such a gargantuan amount of power in the hands of an individual, any individual, this issue of these people who have billions upon billions upon billions upon billions is a sign of societal decline, not only because it's at the expense of the vast majority of people, but also because if that person lacks ethics, God help us.
Well, and also, what's the incentive to have ethics?
Well, that's exactly, because soulless, unfettered capitalism, it's the opposite incentive. It's an incentive to not include that. If you include that in your calculation, you may or may not, and probably will not, improve stockholder value. Even when you were talking about intention before, it's the idea, it's the delusion of neutrality So let's say a CEO of a food company in the United States, we have so many carcinogens in our food that are not even allowed in other advanced democracies, right? Like there was a viral piece recently about the ingredients in a bottle of ketchup here versus a bottle of ketchup in Canada. Because the big food companies wasn't decided, but they realized that there was a certain ingredient, and the ingredient will increase the shelf life of a product. Because it increases the shelf life, it increases the sales, therefore it increases the stockholder value. The decision was to allow that ingredient, even though they knew it was a carcinogen. Okay. Now, was the intention of the CEO that morning to wake up and do what he or she could to give people cancer?
Of course not.
No. Their intention, though, was just to increase stockholder value. So there's this morally neutral, moral neutrality. There is no such thing as ultimate neutrality. You're either helping or you're harming. And we have allowed ourselves to think capitalism doesn't need to have conscience. That's not the role of capitalism. And that CEO would say, hey, I'm just doing what's legal. If you want that to change, you have to elect people who will change it. But too many of the people who are elected are at the behest of the donors who are those corporate forces. So we have to, whether it is Christianity, love one another, whether it is Judaism, love mercy, do justly, walk humbly with our God, or any other religious or spiritual tradition, none of them say it doesn't matter what you do. They all say do what you can to make things better for more people.
Well, and even capitalism. I mean, Adam Smith wouldn't have
Said
bought
it cannot
into this.
exist outside an ethical context. Absolutely.
Right, right. So this idea of, well, I want to say holism, but I think integralism is even a better word, where we look at things in context and we are aware of the connectedness of things instead of isolating everything. That way of thinking is essential. I'm getting ready today after we talk. I'm going to be going and talking to some students at School of Rock. And one of the things I'm going to be talking to them about is this idea that in music, you need to use both sides of your brain. And usually in school, they teach your left side of your brain. Like, they teach you all the different ways that you can voice chords and arrange music and all that. And that's all good. The structural stuff and all that. That's one of the huge achievements of the modern world, is the development of the complexity of musical structure is amazing. But there's this other side of it, the other side of your brain, which is the one that tells you, is it cool? Is it sweet? Is it funky? Is it the right thing to do? It's like one side of your brain can tell you all the things that you could do here, but it's the other side of your brain that tells you which one is the right one. And what I'm trying to do with my students is teach that kind of balance of thinking, because they're going to learn that through music, because music doesn't lie to you. Music tells you when you're on the right track. And so through developing as a musician, it cultivates your brain and your balance. And I'm hoping that they're going to take that with them to whatever they would want to do in the world.
They are. I mean, that's what a great teacher does. Because it's a yin and yang between the left side and the right side of the brain, between the structural analysis, as you were pointing out, and the inspiration that comes about when we are in that space. Did I tell you about that book, The Creative Process?
No, you didn't.
There's this wonderful book called The Creative Process, and it's essays about all these famous artists and scientists and creators throughout history and how they describe the creative process. For instance, Einstein defined the creative process as muscular. There's a famous story from the mathematician Poincaré. And Poincaré was apparently a very famous French mathematician, and he discovered some big theorem or something in math. And he had been working at it at his desk, and his little grandson kept coming in, "Papa, play ball with me." And he said, "No, I'm busy. I'm trying to figure out this incredible theorem or whatever.
Mhm.
And he couldn't get it and he couldn't get it. So finally he went, okay, I'm going to leave the desk. I'm going to go play ball with my grandson. And in a moment when he was throwing the ball, he got it. Also,
Wow.
by the way, did you see the story? I think it was yesterday or the day before. I'll send it to you. Of the two teenage girls in New Orleans, Louisiana, came
No?
up with they solved some mathematical process that they've been working on for 2,000 years.
Really?
Mhm.
Wow.
Mhm.
I'd love to know about that and to know how they did it. And it's
Yeah,
probably related
I'm
to.
gonna send it to you. I'm gonna send it to you.
Okay, okay.
Uh, yeah.
Well, that concept of using both sides of your brain, it seems to me that it's related to one of the main themes of your new book, The Mystic Jesus, because you're talking about the esoteric versus the exoteric approach to understanding Jesus. And, on one hand, you got the sort of left brain people who put together all the rituals and the ceremonies and all that. And they're very much in the word, right? And I mean, when you're a Christian, you got basically two Bibles to read. You got a lot of words to keep track of, right? And then your main practice is prayer, which in the conventional Christian approach, it's really wordy. It's not a lot of just sitting there meditating with silence or with one word maybe. It's like almost a conversation with God, or, it's just words, words, words. But there's another side of your brain that goes beyond the words. And there's the mystical part of all the great world's religions. Like, I was raised as a Christian, and the thing that was cool for me about Jesus from my early age is that I saw him as this mystical figure, even though I didn't have the word for it. But he was this different kind of person who would speak in parables and poetry and music, and he understood things deeper than the surface world. And that was what was so attractive to me, that he was like opening the door to this other deeper world. And then as I got older and I contended more with the judgment involved, it kind of turned me off. And so it created a sort of conflict, because it's like I wanted to keep Jesus in my heart and I wanted to be a good Christian, but at the same time, I saw so many things that were being done, horrible things that were being done in Jesus' name. And it seems to me that because Buddhism did a better job of maybe holding on to that mystical element, maybe it also was able to be less corrupted. And so when
Because
I
it's not a religion, because it's not an institutional religion. It's when something becomes an institutional religion and there's the introduction of dense material reality that the corruption sets in.
I mean, but you do have different sectors or
Yeah, you
sects
have different
of
sects and so
Buddhism,
forth, definitely.
and and you've got the Soka Gakkai and the Zen, and you got people still manage to create that stuff around it, but yet there's this core where it seems like it held on to that mystical tradition, which made it too hard to hold on to
Of
and
course,
pin
miracles
down.
is that way. It's a philosophy. It's a study.
Hmm.
It's not a religion. That's why AA
Hmm.
remains so powerful.
Like when I first started to getting into Buddhism was very attractive to me, because it seemed like a lot of the things that I liked about Christianity, about Jesus, I'll say, there was this other person, this Buddha, who was basically the Jesus from another place. But it held that otherworldly allure for me. Maybe this is a little bit of an aside, but it's interesting to me that in the Hinduism, they have Krishna, and that name Krishna sounds almost the same as Christ. And yet, when you look up the word, they tell you, oh, it's a completely different derivation. Like Krishna from Sanskrit has more to do with his dark color, whereas Christ has more to do with like cream, like an emulsion, like the anointed one. But yet that can't be a
Well,
coincidence to me.
regardless whether or not the words are similar, the archetypes are the same. The
Yes.
traditional, the themes at the heart of all the great religious teachings. I mean, Krishna has to do with death and rebirth, life, death,
Mm-hmm.
creation,
Mm-hmm.
destruction. It's
Mm-hmm.
all the same. I mean, you can look back at the stories of Isis and Osiris and Horus,
Mm-hmm.
thousands of years before the birth of Jesus on the planet, and see
Mm-hmm.
the same themes. So they
Mm-hmm.
have to do with an expression of the truths, deeper truths of human consciousness
Mm-hmm.
as they emerge in this garden, this variety of ways that these essential truths with a capital T can all be can inform the human race.
Mm-hmm.
Word religion comes from the Latin word religio, to bind back. All of those
Mm.
stories bind us back. And once
Okay.
again, going back to what we were talking about, it's not information written with bullet points, it's told in the form of story. And
Mm-hmm.
it's the right side of the brain, of course, that
Mm-hmm.
receives the story and
Mm-hmm.
allows the imprint on our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
And we are starved of something when
Mm-hmm.
these stories are given no meaning. And in the
Mm-hmm.
modern era of technology and rationalism, we have thought of ourselves as having moved beyond that. The
Mm-hmm.
stories of the gods and the goddesses and Krishna and Jesus and Moses and Buddha and Siddhartha. And then we realize, oh my God, that stuff is so much more sophisticated, uh,
Mm-hmm.
not less sophisticated than
Mm-hmm.
the primary psychological truths we tell ourselves.
Mm-hmm. A friend of mine, Brian Murarescu, wrote this book, The Immortality Key, the history of the religion with no name.
Oh,
That's a
wow.
book that I would recommend if you haven't read it. But what he argues in this book is that the early Christians used rituals with psychedelics, and these psychedelics took them into an altered state in which they could see through the veil and see to the other side, and they would no longer fear death. And then when the ecclesiastical tradition really kicked in after a couple of centuries, and the men basically came in and pushed the women aside because the women were mixing the potions and everything, and they changed it. So now we've got the Eucharist, whereas before you would drink these psychedelic wines and you would eat goat meat where the goats had eaten the psilocybin mushrooms. It wouldn't be so toxic that it would kill you, but you could see through the veil. And they had that mystical tradition back then, and now they just give you some grape juice and a wafer.
Well, thousands of years ago, there were mushrooms on the planet, and there was no one to tell you you can't do that. That's illegal. So,
Right,
absolutely,
right.
those were part of sacred rituals, which is why so many of the people, they talk about medicine plant and,
Mm-hmm.
plant medicine and stuff. And that's good. I mean, I think that there is an effort to reclaim a sense of the sacred
Mm-hmm.
around all of this. And psychedelics, obviously, we know about Latin America. These were used for sacred rituals.
And the idea in this book is that when they took that psychedelic ritual out, that contributed toward the sort of demystification of Jesus and of Christianity, and turned it more into this sort of very structured thing. And maybe that also allowed Christianity to get taken in so many other directions that I highly doubt Jesus would have approved of.
Well, first of all, that phenomenon of the not so much the demystification, because if we think of the age of the Enlightenment, the demystification had to do with no longer thinking the priests knew everything. But it was a definite taking of the mystery out, of the right side of the brain out, of altered
Mm-hmm.
experiences out. But that was not just Christianity. It was
Mm-hmm.
human consciousness and civilization. So it had affected all religions. It affected all
Mm-hmm.
institutions, not just
Mm-hmm.
Christianity. In terms of Christianity, have you read Elaine Pagel's book, The Gnostic Gospels?
No, I haven't.
You would love that, because that's
Mm.
all about the fact that Christianity moved, and I refer to it in The Mystic Jesus, but her whole book is about that split between the external orientation, exoteric religion that became the ecclesiastic tradition, that became the idea that the church needed to be your gateway and your gatekeeper, versus the mystical esoteric experience. And it's interesting because you said a few minutes ago about how they pushed the women to the side. They more than pushed them to the side, they murdered them. And so when you actually look at history, because that's what the witch burnings were, and if you look at history and look at what the ecclesiastics did to the mystics, they literally had them running for the hills. And I'm sure you've read about the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. Are you familiar with the Nag Hammadi manuscripts?
No.
Well, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts back, I think it was in the 1950s, I'm not sure. There were these farmers, these nomadic peasants in the land of Judea. I don't know exactly where it was, Israel and Palestine, all of that. And they unearthed these huge jars, and they didn't know what they were. And they opened them, and they unfortunately gave one piece of it to their mother, and she used it to build a fire for dinner. So we'll never know. And some people think it's the Gospel of Mary, but that is what came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, okay.
Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Gospel of Thomas, and so forth. They had been buried because the mystics were chased away.
That burning it for dinner sounds like a scene from a bad Mel Brooks movie or something.
Yeah, I know.
But man, wow. Oh, well, I think we have a similar thing going on in the music world too, because music is something that people just create. There's a mystery to it. We don't know where it comes from, but we go into this deep space and music comes through us. But then we have to deal with the whole structure of the system. It's like the equivalent of the church, because it's like there's this whole institution, and if the institution doesn't approve of it, then it's not going to get out there, or it could even get suppressed.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's the decline of our society. It's movies that come out and aren't given the time to find their audience. If they don't make money immediately, off. And so all that the studios are investing in is movies that 14-year-olds will come, so more gratuitous sex and car crashes. I see it as an author, I see the shift, because my first book came out in 1992. There was more of a sense it was about the words, it was about the book, it was about and now it's about the marketing, and it's everywhere. It's not just in some places. And then, of course, take it back to politics, that it's all become a game of power and money, as opposed to a true conduit for this really what we should consider sacred thing, which is the expression of the will of the people from our deepest place. And all of the above is what has happened when money and power become our bottom line, as opposed to the real flowering of the human spirit, a real flowering of human creativity, a real flowering of human love and possibility. And that takes us back to where we are. We have to be death doulas to that which needs to fade away, and birth doulas to a new world struggling to be born. But the old world is putting up a lot of resistance. There's no doubt about it.
Well, one of the things I like about your campaign platform is you're addressing all these issues, seriously addressing some of the biggest issues today, like climate change, for example. But what you've done is you've pinpointed the fundamental issue of all. It's like, if we can, drop this domino here, it's going to make the other ones fall down. And that is our unfair economic system, the trickle-down economics. A lot of things that we've been talking about go back to that. And we could say, well, that's a product of the modern world in some respects. I mean, I was talking about the emphasis on visualization and all this. There's a lot of different elements to it. But it really got bad around 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's been a 50-year process. That's when it started, was in the 1980s. It's been a 50-year aberrational chapter of American history. It's caused a $50 trillion transfer of wealth from the bottom 90%. And when we say it's a transfer of wealth, it's not just money. Money gives somebody the opportunity to spread their wings. The purpose of money is that you wouldn't have to think about money. Like when you were talking about Elon Musk, he can do this, he can do that. He's got so much money, he can afford to lose, he can afford to explore, right? But the average person is working for him. The average person is working for the man. The average person, it's like internal shackles. And that's why economic justice is so important. It's not just about the money. It's about the fact that economic injustice keeps people from being able to spread their wings. And, if you're only going to get the record deal, you're only going to get the book deal. If you're only going to get the gig, if somebody thinks, well, I can make money off that. And if you only get to run for political office, if that system gets to perpetuate its power, they've got a lock on something, a certain kind of unfettered, soulless capitalism, and the economic paradigm that it represents has got a lock on us. We're in a societal imprisonment here. And first we have to unlock it in our heads, but then to know that it cannot be, this has got to be done very, very carefully. It's got to be an inside-outside approach, and it can't be done without wisdom or responsibility.
Inside and outside. Well, like George Clinton said, free your mind and your ass will follow.
That's right.
And
also Muhammad Ali said, in terms of at least trying, he said, if the mission is right, the odds don't matter. Just keep doing it.
This soulless thing that's going on is really kind of the modern worldview playing out. It's kind of running out of steam. It's given us all it's going to give us. We can't base everything on that anymore. And what's happening is that both political parties are holding on to that modern worldview, but the rank and file have already kind of eschewed it. Like on the conservatives. Yeah, the conservatives are like, well, I like staying traditional. Let's go back to the traditional. And then you have the people on the left who are into this postmodern thing. So nobody's really into the modern world anymore. And yet the parties are telling us that we have to keep playing that modern game. And that's what's telling me that the answer is going to be there. And we're going to figure this out. Just like in the same way that we had this in the music industry. Michael Green, who was president of the Grammys, he published this article like in the late 90s. And he said that the record industry needs to make some big changes or it's going to basically go downhill. And he said what they need to do is get back to the purpose of music, the underlying reason why musicians make music. And he gave some rules. He said, for example, don't you dare sign an artist that you don't ever plan on promoting. Don't like play artists like chess pieces. Like I'm going to sign this one to get them out of the way of this other one, and all those kind of games.
Do that with scripts in Hollywood too. They buy it just to make sure it never gets made.
So just getting back to the purpose of the music, because he said if we don't do that, then the whole industry is going to go down.
Absolutely.
And sure enough, and so now we're at this point where the industry, the core of the industry does certainly play a role still. It certainly has a lot of power, but it doesn't confer the ultimate legitimacy on music anymore. People like a lot of independent artists. There's no stigma in coming up as an independent artist. And what's happening is that because the system has basically decided we're gonna stick to this kind of approved music, then it leaves all this other area open for musicians to create other kinds of music. And so there's an opportunity for people to get outside of that system just because the system has limited itself. We talk about this word system. One important thing with systems is that every system has an inside and an outside. And what happens is that when the system becomes inflexible, then it's paving the way toward its own destruction, because there's always some larger system, and every system has to remain flexible in order to stay within the larger system that it's embedded in. And once it thinks that it's the biggest thing, and so it becomes inflexible, then it's
Exactly
on
what's
its
happening
way.
in politics. That's exactly
Yeah.
what's happening in politics. But in politics, it's even worse because if you don't have the approval of that system, that means you don't have the money to even be heard and get your information out there. It's not as simple as downloading a song so that you still have hope of something going viral. But what you're saying, all of these points apply, and I think that's part of integral understanding, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, that if a point is true, it applies to everything. It applies to music, it applies to art, it applies to education, it applies to politics, it applies to everything. And that's why the great religious and spiritual systems, to me, are so profound because they give us the keys to right living within any system.
Yeah, like Ken Wilber talks about what he calls orienting generalizations. And these are things that are generally true. So it's not just within one specific area, but once you tap into those generalizations,
how life
then
works.
it gives you a perspective on things. It gives you an
Right.
orientation for dealing with whatever comes along.
And you even see it in a natural world where you'll have a movie and they're making a movie about how a terrible natural disaster occurs and they're able to use a bathtub, the water in a bathtub, because it's the same phenomenon.
And you talk about things like, this term, the body politic, is a general term that's out there. But you actually go there and you talk about the society analogous to a body. Like you say, like if all the blood went into one arm, the body's not going to survive, and it's going to kill the arm, by the way, too. That's
Exactly. Blood
analogous
has to circulate and money has to circulate. Blood has to circulate in the body, wealth, and not just wealth, but wealth creation opportunity. It's not just having money, it's having the ability to enough money that I'm going to do something new. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to create a product. If that doesn't circulate in a society, the society can't be healthy. Exactly what you're saying. It's the same. That's what did he say? Generalizations.
orienting
Or
generalizations.
yeah, it's the same generalization.
Well, there's one that I think ties in a lot of what we've been talking about, and I think it's relevant right now because we just had this new article that came out. I think it was in The Guardian, talking about the climate scientists are saying that forget 1.5 degrees, it's going to be 2.5 at least. We're blowing way past. And they said it's actually still possible to reverse it, but this is it. We really have to reverse this now, or we are in just huge trouble. And there's one realization that I had that really kind of explains to me the world that we're living in, and I wish people understood this better, because I think it would help us to understand climate and so many other things that we're dealing with. We were working on a song on my cornucopia album, and we had just finished mixing the song. And my engineer, Brian Lee, said, okay, Stanley, we're done mixing. Let's have some fun. Let me show you something. And he played the mix, and he said, is there anything in this mix that you could change and it wouldn't screw up the mix? And I said something like, I think I could turn the guitar up a little bit and it wouldn't hurt anything. He said, okay, go ahead and turn it up. So I turned it up, no problem. And then after a while, it's like, oh, well, now the guitar's fighting with the keyboard a little bit. He said, okay, what are you going to do about it? Well, no problem. I'll go over here and I'll turn the keyboard up, or I'll move it a little bit to the left, or whatever I did. And then, now that's creating a problem with the drums. And I started chasing down all these different problems. And next thing you know, the whole mix was out of whack. There was no fixing the mix. We would have had to start over. And he said, this is how you know when the mix is finished, because there's nothing you can change without screwing up the whole mix. And so this idea that things happen on a wide spectrum, there's like from the big to the small, it's all important.
You can't mess with nature's ecosystem. It's like what happened in Dubai when they started seeding the clouds and the terrible floods. You don't mess with a perfect system.
So the point with this is that the world is sensitive. And it's like we're talking about the butterfly effect, right? Like one little thing actually can have big consequences. And so we're understanding the world well enough to know that the world is really sensitive. And so everything that we do is potentially having a big effect on the whole. And so we all have responsibility. We can't just say, well, all that matters is if I can improve my quarterly profits. Consequences be damned. I'm just one company out of millions. No, but your effect is bigger than you think.
But you have to have the rising consciousness among your stockholders, that the stockholders, because I've had CEOs said to me, if I did what you wanted me to do, I'd be fired immediately by my board. So that's what responsible investing is about. You need for the stockholders to say, we don't want to make money at the expense of someone's health. We don't want to make money at the expense of other people getting an opportunity. We don't, once again, that moral and spiritual and ethical uprising, which is necessary for people to have enough courage, enough faith, enough commitment, and enough moral core to say no to one thing in order to say yes to something else.
And I also think we not only do we need an alternative, but we also need to work within the system to a degree. Like the fact that you have decided to do your campaign in the Democratic Party. Like so many people have said to me, well, I don't want to vote for Marianne Williamson because she's a spoiler. And I'll say, but she's in the primary. And they're like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, thanks. But anyway, the idea of working within the system, there's so much that can be done because maybe some of these people who are benefiting, even some of the 1%ers, can actually see the light and realize that a change could help them too, like this whole idea with the stockholders and that the stockholder has to be number one. Milton Friedman wrote this really important paper in the early 70s. It really kind of got that going. And this was his reason for explaining why the stockholders should be number one. He said, it's not that they're more important than anyone else. It's not that. What it is that they are the last ones to get paid. Now, there's a piece that I'm missing here, but something about them being last means that if we optimize for the one, if we optimize for the one that's last in line, somehow that's the best optimization.
Which is their profit. Yeah, well, I don't buy that argument morally, but I'll tell you something else that a lot of people don't know about Milton Friedman. He also said that none of this will work unless we have UBI. So wow. He realized, and then people just took his work, but they left that part out. He said, this will not be safe for the average person unless there's a UBI.
Okay.
And the people who wanted to adopt his work left that out.
Okay. Well, then the other thing that I started to think, it occurred to me that, okay, in finance, you got all these equations and you've got things that can fit the equations, but then everything else is an externality. So not that it's not important, it's just that we don't have the equations for it. And so that includes the environment. We don't really have the equations for it. So wait a minute then. Couldn't you make the case that the environment is actually the last in line? Because the environment is the thing that's ultimately going to either lose or win based on all these decisions that we're making. So if you use Milton Friedman's own logic, you should say that we should make the environment more important than everything else.
You could say that about children. The children should be the most important because that's the highest price you're going to pay. I think children are the greatest collateral damage.
So keeping it within the human world, it would be the children because that's the future. So let's just go ahead and take Milton Friedman's own theory, update it for today, and based on Milton Friedman, we have to take care of the children and we have to take care of the environment. I actually
think what we should do, with all due respect to Milton Friedman, is just tear that one up and throw it in the trash bin. Because, if we're going to cut the cord with that aberrational chapter of history, we have to recognize, even though he did say there needs to be a UBI, the whole idea of trickle-down economics, stockholder primacy, and so forth, to me, we need to chuck the whole notion. It is so fundamentally contrary to taking care of people first.
But there are people who are still in that school, and you're not going to convince them otherwise. So we can elect
people who are willing to recognize it's not about convincing anyone. It's not about changing people. It's about retiring them. Young people say to me all the time, Marianne, how do we influence or convince the leaders? And I've moved in my mind, seek to retire them, to replace them. We need a new consciousness in leadership. Some people are not going to be convinced, but there are enough people who are. The issue is the system acts like a fist that makes it too difficult for people who already get it to come forward. The majority of people don't need to be convinced that big food is poisoning your
I see what you mean.
children. The majority of people don't need to be convinced that it's ruining farmers. We have to make space at this point. It's not about trying to convince anyone. By the way, some of these people are nice people. You'd have a good time at dinner with them. They know how to choose wine. They're like the nice, cool people. That doesn't matter.
Sure.
It's not about convincing them. It's about, I'm going to do everything possible so that you're not pulling the levers anymore. And by the way, I think a lot of them know we're right.
So what will it take to get you a speech at the Democratic Convention?
It would take 15%, and one of them that are left. We have Maryland, Oregon, South Dakota, New Mexico, Guam, Virgin Islands, DC, Idaho. But this is the thing. In Maryland and in Oregon, it's not like you need 15% in a state. You need 15% in any one district. So if people go to Marianne 2024.
Really?
Yes, there is still something to totally support, particularly if you know anyone in Oregon or in Maryland. Please know how important those are. So there's something about hanging in there, giving the message that I believe personally is a necessary message in order for the Democrats to win in 2024 anyway. And it's certainly the necessary message in order to heal this country and to help heal the world, whether it has to do with Medicare for all, tuition-free college and tech school, Department of Peace, ending the drug war, guaranteed living wage. There's simply too much suffering out there. And that's the non-quantifiable humanitarian bottom line that we need to embrace. And all the theories otherwise, be damned. We need to love one another and put that first.
And on that note, I think we are in good shape here. Thank you for all you're doing, and I'm so glad you're hanging in there. And people, you know what to do. If any of this resonated with you, then you can help Marianne to get to that spot where more people can hear the message that she's bringing.
Marianne2024.com, and you and I need to go into a studio and me do some talking and you do some playing, and I don't know, Stanley, I think I hope we will.
Let's do that. That sounds great.
Okay, much love to you. Thank you so much. Bye, darling.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
The last time I saw Paris, her heart was warm and gay. No matter how they change her arms